Okay, everyone. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on our virtual space. And so I will start with an introduction. I'm Allison Green, and I serve as the Public Affairs Director for Oregon State Fire Marshal. And so today we are talking about Firewise USA, what motivates folks to start these neighborhoods, how you can start one yourself, and a little bit about Wildfire Awareness Month, the month that we are in. And so just for everybody's awareness, this is being recorded so we can post it later. So we have it recording. So if you're uncomfortable with that, that is your choice, but just full disclosure, we are being recorded. We will have the chat going. So if you have questions, feel free to put questions in the chat and we will try to get to them there. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie Stafford for our facilitation today.
Thank you, Allison. Hello, I'm Stephanie Stafford. I'm a fire risk reduction specialist at the Oregon Office of State Fire Marshal. I'm located in the mid-Willamette Valley, kind of from the Marion County over to Lincoln County area. Also joining me today are Dr. Erica Allen Wolters. She's an assistant professor in political science and associate director of public policy undergrad program at Oregon State University. And I also have Fire Chief Bob Horton. He's a deputy director and executive director of Western Fire Chiefs Association and Applied Sciences Center for Resilient Studies. And Chief Bob Horton was formerly with Jackson County Fire District 3 as a fire chief there. And then I have Chris Babbs, president and CEO of Keep Oregon Green, Christy Shaw, who's the National Fire Plan Coordinator from the Oregon Department of Forestry, and Christy also coordinates the Firewise program in Oregon. And next up, I would like to have Chris Babbs take it over and share a little bit of information about Wildfire Awareness Month.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I just wanted to let everybody know that Oregon recognizes the full month of May as Wildfire Awareness Month. And the timing of it is important. We usually start it or kickstart it a month before fire season. Southwest or Southern Oregon kind of goes into fire season a little bit earlier than other parts of the state, and then maybe 2 months ahead of Northwest Oregon. So we take this month to essentially introduce a new theme for the year, for the month and for the summer. And we really encourage the public to rally around this theme. And rally around preparedness and prevention. And we work with a lot of partners, federal, state, tribal, nonprofits to help us with this. So this year's theme is put your smoky hat on. We're encouraging the public to predict the outcome of their activities when they're outdoors and do all they can to prevent that next wildfire. We know that in Oregon, about 70% of our wildfires are human caused. So, and there are 3 key things that issues that plague our state year in and year out. And so we lean on our good friends over the Oregon Office of State Fire Marshal to start off Wildfire Awareness Month by talking about defensible space, to encourage the public to think about their home and their space around it, take stock of the plants, whether they're flammable or non-flammable, look at that roof to the foundation, take stock of all the combustibles in their in and around their home, and really do all they can to work to reduce the hazard. Work with your neighbors to do the same. You're only as protected as you are with the folks around you, and it's important to reduce the risk to the community as a whole. The second week of Wildfire Awareness Month, ODF will be taking on week 2. And they'll be talking about safe debris burning. It's all about the conditions, not the calendar, folks. So it's important to set up that debris burn pile correctly, stay with it, make sure it's out completely when you're done. And debris burning happens to be our #1 human wildfire issue in the state of Oregon. Then week 3, we're going to turn it over to ODOT, and they're going to take on vehicle fires. Equipment is the #2 leading cause of wildfires in the state of Oregon, and vehicles are a top culprit within that category. So ODOT will help carry the message for week 3. And then for week 4, we're going to lean on all land management agencies to carry the message about campfire safety. So whether it's parks or the Forest Service, BLM, Department of Forestry, we want folks to think about campfire safety leading up to the Memorial Day weekend. And then to close out the month, our good friends over at the Oregon Office of Emergency Management will be talking about evacuation safety, preparing that go kit. They're going to be talking about and defining the evacuation levels. So I think it's going to be a great educational month for the public, and we want to thank everybody for assisting in that effort. And happy Wildfire Awareness Month, everybody. I'll turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Chris. Next up, we will have Dr. Wolters and Chief Horton share the recent information from their studies in Central Oregon and Southern Oregon.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So hello, everybody. I feel a little intimidated being with all of these wildfire and fire experts being here. I am a mere social scientist who looks a lot at basically human behavior and what sort of motivates people to or provides a disincentive for people to engage in certain kind of behaviors that we know are beneficial, either ecologically or in terms of this wildfire, looking at wildfire. And the inspiration behind this work was really at recognizing that in the Western US, we're seeing much more intense fires that are burning more and having more of an impact on certainly homes in the wildland urban interface. So to just be interested in who are the people that are more willing to engage in Firewise activities, and can we then, with that understanding, potentially tailor some policies around that to get more engagement. So next slide, please, Allison. So today we're going to be talking about two studies. One was a survey of Deschutes County residents who are located in the WUI, and the other consisted of interviews with Jackson County residents that Chief Horton will be talking more about. Each of these studies together provide insight into the barriers and opportunities to engage more residents in pre-fire mitigation, wildfire mitigation behaviors. Next slide, please. So looking at the first study, what we were interested in is understanding how something called cultural theory, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and homeowner Firewise behaviors in Central Oregon potentially pair. And the methodology we used in this was mail and online surveys, and they were conducted in the summer of 2021 through the OSU Policy Analysis Laboratory. They were of households that were in the WUI in Deschutes County, Oregon. We sent out 1,500 invitations to participate in the survey, both a physical mail survey and the opportunity to participate via an online Qualtrics link. And of that, 458 surveys were returned with a 30.5% response rate, which might sound low, but that's actually fairly consistent when we talk about surveys within the state of Oregon. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the research goals in this is really to understand who and why people are more likely to engage in wildfire mitigation behaviors. And so we looked at through the lens of a few different things, with a focus ending up being on cultural theory. But in terms of who is participating in Firewise behaviors, we examined the impact of wildfire events. That could be an exposure to a wildfire, evacuation from a wildfire, actually fighting some wildfire near or around their property. We also looked at risk perception. How much do people perceive that there is a risk? And of course, we know that when we send out surveys or when we have these kind of inquiries around risk, and the risk doesn't seem particularly relevant at that time, people may assess risk to be lower. So with all of the rain that we've had this year and all the cold and rainy days, if we were to send out this survey, we might anticipate people's risk perception being lower because they wouldn't be thinking about that as an active risk like they might see it in July or August or September. We were also looking at the proximity to wildlands, like how close were they physically located to wildland areas. We explored demographics, age, gender, income, education, those factors as well. And then we looked more deeply at something known as cultural theory. Please advance the slide. Thank you. So cultural theory was developed in 1982 by researchers Douglas and Wildavsky. Sorry, Wildavsky, I say the name wrong. And what cultural theory basically does is it puts people into these different groups where we can begin to understand a little bit more about their innate worldviews based on how they self-identify in these different categories. And so what we learned from this, or what we know from what the researchers initially presented, is that there's 4 groups that people fall into, and that would be fatalist, hierarchist, egalitarians, and individualists. And as we can see on this, people who are more hierarchical feel that they have less control over their social roles, but they want to act collectively and they tend to follow rules. Egalitarians have more control over their social roles and they want to act collectively again. And then on the other side, looking at fatalists who feel that there's less control over their roles and they tend to act independently, and individualists more control over their individual role in things, but they also act independently. So we sort of have a couple different groups going here and their ways in which we would anticipate behavior to align with that based on how they fall into these groups. Next slide, please. So digging a little bit deeper, though, about the way that we think about cultural theory or cultural worldviews that we can tie into this is also this idea of what would we anticipate these different groups to react in terms of the behavior that they're engaging in, but also how they perceive risk. And so if we look to egalitarians, these are people who would seek to protect nature. They're going to be more community oriented. They're also going to be more risk averse, right? They're going to see, because of that nature, to want to protect the wildlife, people around them. They're going to be more risk averse. And so we would anticipate them to be more likely to mitigate any sort of wildfire danger in and around their property. Hierarchists tend to defer to experts on natural hazards. They are more nature tolerant. They feel that they have more risk aversion as well, but feel like they're more likely to mitigate on this, especially as, again, if it's sort of a top-down sort of directive. Then turning to individualists, they feel nature knows how to balance itself, essentially, and that they're more nature benign. They don't feel like they need to engage in these things because stuff just happens, but they will rely on technology to solve environmental issues, and they feel nature is kind of always in balance. So we would expect them to participate a little less in wildfire mitigation. And then there's the fatalists who are always sort of an interesting group to look at, because in this case, they feel that risk is basically unpredictable. Resources are potentially limited. Basically, they feel like nature is going to do what it wants to do. So they're less likely to mitigate, kind of feeling like there's just kind of the chaos in the world. And so therefore mitigation, maybe they don't find to be something that they feel is very effective on their part. Next slide, please. So looking at who essentially behaved and who did any of these behaviors, and we did use the Firewise guidelines. So we grouped it in sort of general planning, community activities, and others that we'll see on the next slide. But in this, what I'm highlighting here is the percentage that were participating in activity. What was interesting is we anticipated the fatalists to do the least because of their worldview about it being like nature's going to do what it wants. We don't need to be engaged. But in this case, we actually see that individualist reported performing the fewer activities than other groups, and that egalitarians were more likely to engage in mitigation activities around the house at the Firewise actions. The ones that was done the most by kind of all groups is the one highlighted in green there, where people are considering weather reports, planning activities and things that they feel if there might be a fire danger that they're going to pay attention to that. Next slide, please. Continuing on, looking at the Firewise activities here, again, we see that the individualists, again, are the least likely overall to participate in the activities. You can see the percentages there, 17.1 in terms of like planting fire-resistant plants. And we see egalitarians, again, performing the highest on this. And areas that I want to draw attention to of categories where we see people overall generally performing higher or above 50% is pruning the branches of all trees within 85 feet of your house, 85 feet of your home, and then looking at cleaning roof surfaces, gutters, and surrounding vegetation. What we wanted to make note of course, is these are also sort of regular household maintenance. And so the things that were maybe a little bit more action in terms of requiring more effort, more time, special equipment, things of that nature, you're going to have people less likely to engage in that. So sort of that low-hanging fruit of things that people do as part of the regular home maintenance, we see that that's holding pretty consistently true, that most people are doing those behaviors. But when we get to the other more detailed behaviors that people can do, and potentially importantly impactful behaviors, we start to see sort of a fall off of people engaging in those. Next slide, please. So looking at, and then this is, so I'm just highlighting here so we can kind of keep it easy to understand. So we did a regression analysis to understand essentially who were the people that were performing the most, looking at those variables that I described initially in this study. And what we found is that, yes, people who are concerned about wildfire are going to perform more Firewise activities than other people. Those who think that there's a higher probability or a higher risk of fire occurring are also more likely to engage in more wildfire mitigation strategies. Those who have had experience with a wildfire, again, if they've been evacuated, if they've had a fire near their home, if they've had to actually fight some fire in or around their property, those people are going to be more likely to engage in Firewise activities. And then we also examined the role of rules, meaning like building codes or other rules that might affect the community regarding wildfire. If those are present, we do find that people engage in more Firewise activities. And then looking at the wildland area, those who are closer to the wildland, obviously feeling more of an impactful thing to want to mitigate. And then we find what I just showed you is that the individualists are saying they're least likely to perform these activities, where the egalitarians are more significantly likely to participate in Firewise activities. Next slide, please. So what we take away from this study, or what we found in terms of the conclusion of this study, is that what we found the factors that were impacting wildfire mitigation or people participating in Firewise activities, it is concern, the risk or the probability that they assume that a fire might impact them, experience, again, evacuation, something that they've had a direct wildfire experience. Any rules that impact the community is important to consider, proximity to the wildlands. And then, as you saw, we did find that cultural theory or the cultural worldviews were predictive of people either engaging or not engaging in Firewise activities. Next slide, please. So the takeaways from this study and kind of this study alone is that community requirements we find can be effective in motivating individuals to engage in pre-fire or Firewise mitigation actions. And that sometimes a top-down approach, so like rules like building codes, can also be effective because it sort of takes the navigating or negotiating off of the individual. It's just something you have to do in order to live in that area, or potentially have, you have to be able, if you're going to build, that there's building codes and standards that must be met. Egalitarians could potentially be nudged. So people who are already identifying as being egalitarian might be able to be nudged more with appeals to community safety. Like, how do we get egalitarians to do more pre-fire mitigation strategy or engage more in Firewise? Is to really get out there with community appeals. Like, you're not just doing this for yourself, you're doing it to protect your community, and having sort of a broader message that they would be more likely to respond to. Whereas we find individualists might respond better to market-based incentives. If there's some sort of benefit that they're able to get from that, from participating in this system, then they might be more motivated because that's something that they would intend to respond to. But looking overall, though, we do find that egalitarians, people who identify as hierarchical, are more receptive to financial incentives as well. Pretty much most all people are receptive to financial incentives, to land use regulations, and to building standards. But one of the things that I wanted to mention as we talk about this study is recognizing that cultural traits or cultural theory, it's not monolithic. It's not as if you identify somebody as an egalitarian, that's who they always are in every context. There's parts of you it's really more identifying your more dominant trait, as opposed to just isolating it and saying you're always in this category. So I think it would be wrong to say that we can't address things where, with fatalists, with individualists, with hierarchists, or with egalitarians based off of where they fit in this, as opposed to looking at opportunities to nudge behaviors a little bit more based on this that might also flag those other cultural traits or values that they share. Because it's not really correct to say that individualists only think of themselves and don't think about community, because that might break down a little bit if you get people who are very connected with their neighbors. Maybe they have a potluck every summer. There's something that's bringing that community together. Might indeed also help to inspire that. So we see a real avenue in terms of having those sort of community champions, or sort of those places that might come into effect of engaging people who otherwise might not engage, But if they feel that they're sort of part of this broader community, no matter where you sit on this, on the cultural traits, you still might get movement. But again, looking overall, what we can take away from that is that we do know that we have a group of people, i.e. those who are identify more egalitarian, who are going to be more receptive to sort of all of the opportunities to engage, feeling that they are more risk averse. They don't want to risk things with wildfire. So they're going to be generally more receptive to any sort of messaging around that. But it's just a different way in which to think about how to appeal to people to become engaged, as a way of appealing to maybe these underlying cultural traits or worldviews that might help inspire more action. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chief Horton.
Thank you, Professor Walter. Stephanie, thank you for having me today. It's great to be here with everyone. I want to share a little insight into this other project in Jackson County that we had the pleasure of working on. Just by a little bit of way of background, the Western Fire Chiefs Association's Applied Sciences Center, part of the role of what we do is to help socialize the best in science and help drive it into practice, into programs and policies in the fire service so we can better serve our communities. So we work with best-in-class scholars like Professor Walters and the work that they're doing and make sure that this type of information becomes useful to decision makers at the policy and program level. The project I'm going to talk about right now, it actually started when I was the fire chief at Jackson County Fire District 3, where we really had a culture of experimentation in our organization. We wanted to implement policies and programs that worked. And so we needed to really study the effect of these types of programs. So we had submitted for a state and local government innovation grant through the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is a nonprofit research arm through MIT, on the work that they try to do is to reduce the ill effects from a variety of different domains on poverty. And there's an accepted nexus between climate actions and poverty. And so we were proud that they selected this project, and it gave us an opportunity to engage with Professor Walters and the Oregon State University Policy Analysis Lab to study our area, Jackson County's region in Southern Oregon, to understand a little bit more about what barriers do or do not exist in folks' willingness and or ability to create defensible space. This project I'm going to talk about right now is actually used to inform another project where we're in partnership with the Poverty Action Lab in the Oregon State Fire Marshal's office. This informed an incentive design where we actually launched that this week, a research team to try to drive take up of defensible space through various incentive conditions. And so we'll hopefully be back sometime in the future to talk about what that looked like as well. This particular project was on the heels of Senate Bill 762. I was fortunate to have a seat at the table and be part of that process. We chuckle a little bit now because I think we've all seen sort of the reaction to the wildfire map, and maybe chuckle isn't the word that we all would use, but that's the one I'll use right now. That helped set our sample. We were looking for folks who were identified in higher extreme wildfire danger in Jackson County Fire District 3's jurisdiction. We wanted to talk to those residents. So we did a solicitation from August of 2022. We completed our interviews in January 2023. We spoke with 23 individuals that self-selected to participate in our study. Next slide, please. And so our team visited with these folks, spent about an hour with the folks in our community and asked them 28 semi-structured questions that focused on these general themes that have been informed by some of the other work that Professor Walters and others have done in this area. Understanding their past experience with wildfire, how do they understand risk of wildfire, efforts to mitigate that risk, what awareness of programs, incentives, and regulations existed that they had. And I'm just going to, spoiler alert, I was heartbroken as the local fire chief with all the effort that I had put into trying to communicate what programs we had put in place to help people. This particular sample of folks we spoke with were not too familiar with the programs that we had put in place. So while I was heartbroken, it was quite informative that at least with this group, our outreach strategies were unsuccessful. And then we asked some demographic questions because we also felt like that would be important to inform this larger discussion. Next slide, please. So here you can sort of see a little bit of the variables that we had asked. This is some of the demographic, socio-demographic information that we gathered on our folks here. Little bit, higher income class is what we found that our sample got. So we're kind of back to the drawing boards right now, the policy analysis lab and our team at looking at oversampling socially vulnerable populations. Some of you may know Senate Bill 762 called out social vulnerability as a priority for how risk reduction funds are going to get invested across this state. And that's a difficult challenge that we're trying to do a better job of understanding and oversampling in that population so that we can invest those dollars the way our legislature intended for us to. Next slide. So here's what we found through these conversations. Most participants in our study cited they regularly performed yard and property maintenance. Again, they self-reported that they were doing these things. Most said that they do invest and maintain defensible space. Those having experience with wildfire stated taking stronger protocols for defensible space. That is consistent with other studies that have talked to folks that are in wildfire prone region. Like, if you've experienced wildfire, you're more likely to have a different understanding of risk than perhaps those who maybe moved to the area who've never experienced wildfire. People with income levels over $100,000 per year were more likely to state that they had no obstacles to maintaining defensible space. And participants felt that others, so when now asked about risk interdependency between, we asked a lot of questions about how do you manage your property, but what are your thoughts on how your neighbors might manage their property? Neighbors in this case was like actual neighbors, not BLM or Forest Service or some of these large timber areas that they might be concerned about. These were households and folks' other properties near them. And in these cases, they generally sort of stated that they felt like neighbors were facing barriers like physical barriers, disabilities, mobility issues that would prohibit them from being successful at creating defensible space on their property, as well as financial barriers to wildfire preparedness. It can become cost prohibitive for folks is sort of the lesson that we took away from that. The asterisk here is just this information helped inform the randomized control trial that I was just talking about earlier that got launched earlier this week on various incentive-based models to see what may be effective and how we invest or provide these resource solutions where barriers exist so that we can get the greatest effect at overall community wildfire risk reduction. Next slide, please. We were really curious about the regulatory impact. Just as a reminder, this is on the heels of Senate Bill 762. This is in Southern Oregon. There was a lot of tension mounting, in our local media related to additional regulations coming from defensible space codes that was talked about as part of the bill. This is on the heels of folks, receiving either non-renewals or premium increases on their homeowners, their property insurance that got, sort of from my perspective, unfortunately correlated to this MAPS release. So, we knew everybody was sort of equally impacted by what that information looked like. And we were very curious on what their position was in terms of willingness to take action as it related to regulatory posture or this quasi-regulatory posture via their home and property owners insurance. So here's a little bit of what our findings were regarding that and some of this seeking assistance question. So policy tools we evaluated there. Next slide, please. So some of the takeaways we got from this just immediately that Jackson County Fire District 3 started to implement into its workings, and this was communicated also a little more broadly across different fire service agencies across the state through the Chiefs Association, was looking at how we communicate about programs and risk. That's a real important piece that I think a lot of our audience I know is real attentive to. One flyer that goes out that communicates the same message to everybody isn't going to be received the same way. That is also so useful to what Professor Walters was just talking about on the Deschutes study. We can tailor messages to various communities, and we believe that's gonna increase the effect that we have of the messages that we're producing. Making really readily available and our grants and assistance such as vouchers, rebates, and other financial incentives to help drive take up of defensible space behaviors. what we know very well from the lengthy experience that we've had with Firewise communities is that having a community champion who can communicate about wildfire mitigation actions and incentives is incredibly helpful in getting the message out. You know, we neighborhood level, community level champions, we cannot overstate how important that is, and coordination and cooperation between local fire agencies and those community champions, I think is, I would argue, is perhaps one of the most critical roles that needs to be filled for us to take mitigative actions to help protect our communities. And then site visits to understand the most effective actions. Again, this is, if you've been in one community, you're in one community, and we have to just be very open to a diverse approach to the different communities across our state, the different risk levels, the different socio-demographics, the different political ideologies across the state are going to have different reactions to the approach that we take. So we really welcome what we're learning from these types of studies and future studies that are going to be scaled up about our state, so we can really tailor these messages broadly to our communities so that we can actually have, you know, really strong measurable effect on risk reduction. Next slide, please. All right. So really part of the key takeaways is we do feel like that barriers do have an influence on households' wildfire preparedness level. There was sort of this thought that, well, maybe there weren't barriers. Maybe we're over assuming what, you know, barriers really existed. We do feel from this research and other studies that barriers are having an influence on a household's wildfire level. What I mean really by that is it's not just an education need. It's not just informing somebody that says, oh, you're at risk, you should do something about it. That's a piece, but there are broader impacts to household level decision making that we want to make sure as a fire service and community professionals that we're mindful of that. Resources are believed to help remove actual and perceived barriers. Resources sort of defined in this context is time, money, effort, tools, etc. Some folks, you know, have the willingness and the ability to do it, but they don't have a truck, they don't have a trailer, they don't have access to a chipper, right? They don't have the tools that are necessary. We as the fire service tried to discourage open debris burning for a lot of reasons. What's most notable, of course, besides the environmental impact, is the spread. You know, we are seeing really catastrophic spreads of debris burns. So we wanted to try to limit that. And environmental conditions have changed in Jackson County such that open burning wasn't even available due to the extending lengths of our fire seasons, and our burn windows were closed. So folks for decades who were used to debris burning to help remove some of their fuels off their property have now found that to be a tool no longer available to them. So, you know, we as a fire district try to introduce some new methods for them to get that debris off other than burning. So really the point here on the takeaway is those resources have found to be incredibly useful. And we're really proud that the State Fire Marshal's office has been able to get some dollars distributed across our state to increase that tool accessibility and availability across the state of Oregon. And insurance availability and rates seem to have an effect on attitudes and perceptions related to risk reduction at the household level. This is some sort of next level research that we're going to be talking about, Professor Walters and the team at Oregon State, about how to understand and unpack this insurance effect a little bit greater. That definitely got folks' attention, as it rightfully should. This is not just an Oregon challenge. We're starting to see this emerge across all wildfire prone regions in the Western United States. We're very concerned about how insurance rates are going to impact property owners, and we want to understand it a little bit better. And the Western Fire Chiefs are in great partnership with insurance industry right now, trying to work through some policies where those who are taking these mitigative actions are recognized that they have done so when it comes to their insurance renewals. Next slide, please. Dr. Walters, do you want me to keep going, or you want to wrap us up with the conclusion?
I can jump back in. Thank you,
All
Chief Horton. Okay, so looking at both of these studies together, Chief Horton and I just sort of came up with some ideas about, you know, what are the broad takeaways. And as he just mentioned, you know, reducing barriers to wildfire preparedness is huge. You know, he was talking about debris. One of the things that came up in interviews is just sort of general discussion about having a debris pickup day, something where people then, because if you cannot burn or we're trying to discourage burning, something that makes it easy for people. Anytime that you sort of, make things a lot easier, people will engage in that behavior. Providing market-based incentives. People are more receptive to incentives and other resources to reduce barriers. Building outreach that appeals to different cultural traits, different identities or cultural theory identities is certainly something that would be helpful. And as Chief Horton mentioned, certainly communication is important, but considering that some of the people that we reached out to, many of the people were older residents of the state, and making sure that we are targeting things in two different ways, both via email and then from direct mail, so that people are getting information in the way that best appeals to how they like to receive information. And then again, like the idea of just establishing some rules around building codes or other things for new construction that could sort of take the guesswork out of it and just make it something that has to happen when you are building in the WUI or in other parts of the state as well. And I also did want to mention, when we thought about in our interviews, we had less ability to sort of really parse out a bunch of the demographics, except for, as Chief Horton mentioned, the income. In the Deschutes County, we did find that age and gender were relevant to those who were engaging in Firewise activities, where we find younger people to engage more often and women to engage more often. One, because we know that women generally assess risk higher than males do, and that in the case of younger people, a lot of that has to do with both physical ability and potentially time elements of that. And what we found during the interviews as well is that age and mobility were often identified together as a barrier to being able to do some of these actions. And so ways in which, again, there can be some sort of incentives or some sort of ways to reduce that particular physical barrier that people might be experiencing, to sort of help, again, with not only their property, but the broader community. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walters and Chief Horton. I think you've given us all a lot to think about and how we can improve our programs and work together to adapt things to provide better resources to the people of Oregon. I'm going to pass it off to Chris Babb. She is going to share a little bit about Firewise and has some questions for you.
Well, maybe I'll let Christy Shaw address the Firewise stuff. And I didn't see any questions in the chat, so maybe Allison can help monitor that while I'm talking. But so many things are going through my mind right now. And maybe I can tie this to my own personal situation, right? So I kind of live and breathe wildfire preparation and prevention in my work life, but trying to carry that over into my personal life and my neighborhood. When I'm listening to the speakers talk about the carrot stick approach, I'm thinking about my situation, and I think there's a spectrum probably across the state of Oregon that people could relate to, but I'm new to my community. I don't know my neighbors. We just moved into the area, built literally a Firewise house from the roof to the foundation and out to the 100 feet. And I'm trying to get my neighbors to do the same, but I don't know who they are. And then maybe there's another situation on the spectrum where folks have been in a community for a really long time, but they don't know their neighbors. And it took a wildfire to bring them together. And then maybe there's some folks in between who know their neighbors very well and have had those common conversations, but wildfire was not a topic. So in my case, I'm challenged with an area, and I'm sure this would be typical for a rural area in Oregon, where maybe they don't necessarily trust government. They're not necessarily eager for government handouts. I mean, we talk about money as an incentive, but they're not necessarily receptive to free money, free government money. I'll put that out there. And they're out there in the WUI for a reason. They've accepted the wildfire risk, and they don't necessarily want to get to know their neighbors. So I'm going to throw that out there as another barrier, and see if any of that came up in your conversations, your community conversations. I'm looking over I'm kind of reviewing your communication outreach strategies and how to appeal to that spectrum. Email, direct mailing, when you don't know your neighbors, you can't do some of that. It takes a spark plug like me to get something like this going, but I'm going to tell you who I'm leaning on. It's the Small Woodlands Association. It is the Soil Water Conservation District, the NRCS folks up in our area, and ODF, who are kind of carrying the torch. And I would throw OSU and the Oregon Office of State Fire Marshal in there as well, really trying to start this conversation around the state. So I just want to, so there's a long-winded setup for you there, and just wonder if either of you have any comments about that.
Well, it didn't come up as much in our interviews, but I was thinking as you were talking about Deschutes County and the fact that a lot of, especially in Deschutes, we have high levels of amenity migration. So sort of like what you're saying, people moving in from other places, maybe not knowing the neighbors in that. And sometimes it does take a focusing event, which is what we want to avoid, right? In order to get people to act. Building community is something that is you either try to intentionally do, or something makes you do it, because of an event. So I would just sort of, I guess, not to deflect the question, but in a way sort of think about the ways in which we can, even people with different ideological backgrounds, with different worldview backgrounds, we can still find commonality. So it's, important to be able to say, we might not want these incentives. We don't want the government coming in and telling us what to do. But then again, that's maybe when you rely on like a community champion, somebody who could try to want to bridge those gaps. But I think it's difficult. I'm going to be honest about that. I think it is difficult sometimes to engage with people who like the idea of sort of being that maybe they are more individualists. They want to just have their own space and they want to make their own decisions pertaining to certainly their property. So it might be a little bit of nudging in a different way. I know I was just talking to students about ways in which, if we talk about carrots versus sticks, I think you'd get a lot of probably very angry people if you had things relying on sticks to get this behavior. But places like the city of Seattle, when they introduced composting, it was mandatory, and if you didn't do it, then you would get a very small fine, or they'd refuse to pick up your trash. I'm not suggesting that that's the way to go in this case, because I think, again, what you would meet with would be potentially people becoming more entrenched and not liking government and things like that. So that's why I think what we found was really thinking about how do we incentivize and make it a positive environment in which to engage in this, as opposed to creating a net negative. I don't know, Chief Horton, did you have any thoughts on that?
The only thing I would add is it wasn't necessarily informed by our study, but anecdotally, our office, when I was the fire chief, on the heels of the letters coming out identifying what parcel risk class folks were in when the map first got released, we had anticipated that the frustration we were hearing about, through the news media was going to percolate with phone calls to our office, and we in fact experienced the very opposite, that folks became concerned. That they were informed about their high level risk and wanted to know what they could do about it. Again, anecdotal, we are a politically conservative region of the state, so that was a surprising finding to me, but I think more engaged than I think we had anticipated, which I was really happy about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So there is a question in the chat. I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to follow up, I think, with something that might be similar, but says, did the public health impacts of wildfire smoke come up in either of these studies in terms of people's perception of how wildfire risk, and also how mitigations to home hardening for smoke impacts could be incorporated into Firewise program for incentivizing building standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was not included in the Deschutes County survey. We were sort of looking at a different focus on that. And in terms of the interviews, and Chief Horton can help me out on this, if it was, I know that there were questions that got around that, but it wasn't, as far as I recall, I don't think it was like a big topic that people spent a lot of time on, other than just talking about, it felt like the focus was more on property damage. But Chief Horton, do you have a different recollection?
No, that's exactly how I recall it too. It didn't come out as a predominant theme, although we didn't, ask specifically about that. But I do think what what Brendan is suggesting in terms of considering, this totality of fire, and the effects of fire, particularly relates to smoke, should be incorporated into these policy discussions. And the overall effect of what home hardening and risk reduction does is sort of not just reducing your risk to your fire being destroyed, your home being destroyed by fire, but these community impacts broadly on smoke, which is drawing in many cases a larger concern in our communities is smoke. I mean, of course, more communities are being impacted by smoke than are being impacted by fire. So it's it in and of itself is a focusing event, to Professor Walter's point.
And so, oh, go ahead, Erica.
Oh, no, I was nodding in agreement.
Okay, so maybe this is a good time to plug the OHA website or the Oregon Office of Emergency Management websites to consult if you have interest in reading more about wildfire smoke and how to mitigate that. So with that, I think it's easy to capture people's attention when smoke is in the air. It generates that sense of urgency year in and year out each summer, but how, and I'm going back to that quote that I saw up on Chief Horton's slides. Those who had experienced wildfire took stronger protocols for defensible space. And so how do we sustain that sense of urgency in the off season? Or even years down the road after, here we are after the 2020 fires, how do we sustain that sense of urgency so that, how can folks keep thinking about that need for defensible space? Turning fire season preparation into a seasonal habit, just like you were talking about, Erica, with, composting or recycling or brushing your teeth. I mean, how do we make that a habit?
Yeah, I think that's challenging because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way that people perceive risk is really temporal. It's when they are experiencing it is when they tend to really have their highest sense of risk, right? So it's kind of drawing off of how do we sort of maintain that energy for it other parts of the year where maybe we're not directly experiencing it. But I think that this would get to, in part, if there's the ability to have something like, again, like debris pickup or things that would just become part of what is done, you're creating social norms around that in which hopefully people then engage, right? So it becomes less about them having to think about what they're doing and more like, oh, here's my bin for my waste, or here's when they're going to come and pick up debris. And it's just something that's sort of automated for them, I think can be a helpful way of engaging people. Because, what we know about other ways in which people have been engaged, like recycling or composting or anything of that nature, really, it wasn't so much that people were demanding that they have these bins at their house to be able to do it. But once it was provided, oh, okay, I'll use it. It's here. It's easy to do. So any way that we can sort of reduce the thought process behind it, the activity or money or time invested in it is a way that you're going to get people to have more take up of these behaviors.
Okay. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we have I think this is a great time maybe to talk about the Firewise program if Christy Shaw is still with us. The question is how to go about setting up a Firewise community. So wondering if Christy's still with us, if she can address that question.
Absolutely. So I'm going to say it depends. And I only say it depends because in many instances, you can start that process by working with your local contact at an ODF office. There are some areas where ODF is not kind of the main contact, and such as in Northeast Oregon, one of the contacts is Willow Resources, Nikki Beachy there. So in some cases, you might contact the ODF office and they may actually refer you somewhere else. But if you're interested in kind of what it takes and what it might involve, starting with the Firewise website is a really great place because you can actually go on, you can see the template that you'll complete as part of the application, or you can use that as a basis to create your own. But it kind of it walks you through even some of the training modules that are on there that will talk about how to create defensible space, the things that you might look for in an assessment. All of those pieces are there on the Firewise website. As well as you can reach out directly to me and I can kind of walk you through some of the parts and help you get started and make sure that you get in contact with the person that you need to get in contact with. one thing that I was going to say earlier is that I really believe that Firewise is super relative and works really well in Oregon because it is a kind of grassroots concept in that the communities themselves are the ones who are starting that process. It's all voluntary. You're not, it's not like neighbor against neighbor or anything like that. It's actually a coordinated effort with neighbors helping neighbors and educating neighbors. So it's very, very successful in that manner. And then what I have seen across the state is that areas where Firewise grows other Firewise communities. We have counties in the state that are just now starting to get their first community. And then we're starting to see that as the first community has been recognized, then there's other communities that are starting to show interest in areas where people are reaching out. And so it's kind of like that growth from within rather than, so it's like the voluntary piece, it's not regulatory, it's not mandated. I do believe that we will see, based on some of the information that's coming through in terms of trying to have more educational opportunities out there. And some of those will be regulatory at some point potentially, that will grow, but also just that growth from within is where we're going to see the best impact and the kind of long-term sustainability of those communities, because it's them doing it. It's not us coming in as a one-time incentive or a one-time educational opportunity. It's them wanting to do those activities. So I'm not sure if I answered the full question, Chris, but I think the biggest way to do it is to, one, get on the website and look and see what you might need, but two, reaching out for the support. The process begins and that you reach out and you look out, but then ODF or whoever it is, might be the regional coordinator, is going to help you provide that assessment and walk you through that template and walk you through the process with it all, and help you come up with action items with it.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, I just want to stress that you can do all you can around your home, but you're only as safe as the neighbors around you. It's really a community effort to keep everybody safe from wildfire. So there is a question in the chat and I don't know how to answer it. It says, what's the difference between a Firewise community and a fire safe council? This is somebody from California who has fire safe councils. I know Montana does too. Oregon does not. Does anybody?
I will maybe take a stab at that.
Thanks.
So Mary Beth, thank you for the question. I currently in my role right in public affairs for the Office of State Fire Marshal, but in some of my previous roles, I was working at kind of the local, county, and regional level on a lot of these type of activities. So I'll take a shot at it, and then I'll also drop my email in the chat, and maybe we can chat a little bit more offline. So fire safe councils, right, they are kind of specific state to state. There are some that they're really great organizing groups. And I will say those groups really tend to work at varying levels, right? So sometimes they're counties, sometimes they're a few neighborhoods, a city. They kind of work at whatever the right size is. Versus Firewise is really individual neighbors working together toward community action, where Fire Safe Council, I mean, sometimes they dive into CWPPs, they dive into, organizing chipper programs. I mean, they dive into some of the bigger umbrella, where Firewise really is that initial groundswell that starts in communities. So like I said, I'll drop my email in the chat if you want to chat more about those. But I think for me, that's kind of the main difference between those two.
Are they nonprofits? I've seen them apply for federal grants in California.
I think it really depends. I think in California, it's pretty consistent for them to be some sort of 501c3 or some type of nonprofit. But sometimes they're just a coordinating group that gets together because they want to start a CWPP or they have multiple Firewise communities. So it really depends. Sometimes 501c3 so they can secure funding for projects.
Sounds like Firewise is a little closer to the ground. Fire Safe Council is a little more up here. Okay. There's some other, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. There are some other questions in the chat, but it looks like they're being addressed by others in the chat. So I'll kick it back to either Allison or Stephanie to close us out.
Hi. Allison, can you switch the slide?
I can.
Hello, I just want to thank everyone today for coming to the webinar. And if you have any questions, you can email us at crr@osp.oregon.gov. The email address is on the screen. You can also visit our website. If you're interested in any of the upcoming webinars, you can use your phone right now and scan the QR code, or you will probably receive notification on how you attended this webinar. We have another webinar on May 10th. It will be exciting. 5 E's of community risk reduction with the wildfire focus. We'll have Justice Jones from Texas and Chris Chambers from Ashland Fire. So please join us for the next webinar. And I think that covers everything. If you don't have anything to close, Allison.
You know, as I was typing. So I want to just thank everybody for spending their lunch hour with us. We tried to do this so folks could spend some time with us. And thank you for all the great questions and the great information from our presenters. So like I said at the beginning, this is recorded. So the slides, the whole presentation, and the questions, of course, will be posted within 24 hours on our website for OSFM. So feel free to share that, go back and watch. And I have dropped a couple of contacts into the chat. So if you have more questions, don't hesitate to follow up with us about those. And I think with that, we will let everybody get on with their Wednesday. But thank you all so much. And thank you, special thank you to our presenters for all the great information today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.